Hey everybody, thanks for checking out the Awesome Walter YouTube channel. If you like what you see, make sure you subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when new videos are going up. Today, I'm going to talk about a subject that has been sorely lacking on here, and that's pro wrestling, specifically WWE. I've been a fan since 2002, and while I don't watch every single week anymore, I still keep up with what's going on and check in often. That's mostly thanks to the Salamonster Sounds Off podcast. You should check it out if you haven't, by the way. A few years ago, I did 3 WWE countdowns on the old Top 5 show over at Channel Awesome, but due to WWE's ridiculous copyright claims, it just became too much of a liability to cover any more on that series. Hopefully we don't get much of that on my little old channel here, but I really wanted to talk about some wrestling, so I'm going to do it anyway. Today, I'll be presenting to you my top 10 favorite WWE wrestlers. Now, before we get into this, I'm not saying these are objectively the best, these are just my favorites, because, well, I like them. And take into account, I wasn't allowed to watch wrestling during the Attitude Era, so I missed most of the big boom. But since then, I've gone back and watched a ton of old weekly shows, pay-per-views, and more from WWE, WCW, ECW, etc. So, while I have a decent knowledge base of what came before I started watching, you'll see that a lot of my favorites are from after the period when I first became a fan. Also, these guys are mostly well known for their WWE runs. Not saying they didn't have huge success anywhere else, but it will mostly be focused on their time spent in WWE. Alright, ring the bell and let's get into this. Number 10, Christian. So I love those old tag team matches with the ENC, the Hardys, and Dudleys. Who doesn't? That was some of the earlier stuff I went back and watched where I realized how great Christian was. However, I didn't really start taking a liking to him until he cut his hair and feuded with Chris Jericho in 2004. The feud that never really was with John Cena made me an even bigger fan. Then he was gone to TNA for a few years and had some amazing matches while building his reputation as a more important player. His return to WWE is where some of my favorite stuff from his career came. His stuff in the WWE CW years solidified him as a veteran who could have a good match with most guys. After that, winning the World Heavyweight Championship from Alberto Del Rio was such a great moment to watch. I love that he got to have that. Then, his feud and incredible set of matches with Randy Orton in 2011 were some of the best highlights in the whole company that year. I have some fond memories of seeing him live in Chicago as well. At my very first Raw, he was in a main event ladder match with Rob Van Dam for the IC title, a really good match. Then, years later, I saw him win the world title from Orton by DQ at Money in the Bank. Not a great finish, but I was there to see his second world championship win. Neither of those title runs were really allowed to be good, but I'm glad he can be called a former world champ, and he squeezes onto my list at number 10. Number 9, Matt Hardy. It goes without saying that Matt has had his ups and downs over the years, but I've been a big fan of his since I started watching. This traces all the way back to him and Jeff's little feud with Brock Lesnar in 2002. Seeing them take on Brock back then was pretty cool and led to a few brutal chair shots that I can still see and hear clear as day. Of course, just like Christian, I loved his earlier days in those ladder and TLC matches, but again, I really took a liking to him later when he was a singles guy. The Cruiserweight V1 version of Matt was a really good heel. With his little MFer Shannon Moore by his side, Matt had an awesome feud with Rey Mysterio. Then, the infamous Edge-Lita situation came up, and I'll admit I was totally invested in that whole thing. How they turned it into an angle was really smart business-wise, and Matt may never have been hotter as a babyface. Matt and Edge had a few really solid matches, including that cage match where Matt hit a leg drop from the top. Smart? No, but damn, it looked epic. His move to SmackDown involved a feud with MVP over the US title, and I was really pulling for Matt at that point. That might have been when I was most behind him. He later won the WWE CW title, which I've always really liked the design of for some reason, before being let go in 2010. Obviously, Matt eventually had some big success outside of WWE with the Broken gimmick, and when the Hardy Boys made their comeback at WrestleMania 33, it was a moment. It was great to see the broken/woken stuff on WWE TV, and it worked for a while. At least we got something different with that Ultimate Deletion match against Bray Wyatt. He recently won the tag titles on SmackDown with Jeff, but now that Jeff's out injured again, we'll see what they do with him. I'm always going to wish the best for Matt Hardy. He's a super talented and creative guy. I hope we see one last decent singles run from him before he hangs up the boots for good. Number 8, Daniel Bryan. I think it's safe to say now that Daniel Bryan was one of the most popular babyfaces since the 1990s. Maybe not the most popular when you include a few guys left over from the Attitude Era, but for more modern times, he's way up there. Good as he is as the underdog, Bryan is much more than that. He's a great heel and of course a phenomenal worker in the ring. I remember hearing about him before he came to WWE, and the first big moment I can recall is when he snapped on Michael Cole in NXT, which was great. His almost career-long feud with The Miz has been very entertaining since it started all the way back on that original NXT show. I was hoping we'd get that match this past year at WrestleMania, but it wasn't to be. Not complaining at all about what we got instead, though. Through his controversial Nexus Invasion firing up through his first world title win, Bryan had a lot of good matches and succeeded in both good and bad guy roles. But it was the yes chant and his unceremonious 18-second loss to Sheamus at WrestleMania 28 that started his mega popularity. From then on, the crowds were 100% behind Bryan no matter what WWE did with him, and I was right there cheering with everyone else. The lead up to WrestleMania 30 featured some of the best reactions I had seen in forever. When he turned on the Wyatt family was especially crazy. That whole time period was just really special. It was great to see someone so organically over that was pushed to where the fans wanted him to be. He was our guy. Injuries followed, and we all know Bryan was forced to retire because of repeated concussions. But against all odds, he was cleared to wrestle again a few years later, and it's been great to have him back. The crowds cooled on him shortly after his return, but his new heel persona has been a really entertaining one. I saw him win the Money in the Bank ladder match in Chicago way back in 2011, and that was an awesome milestone in his career to see live. Here's hoping to years more of Daniel Bryan's great work. Number 7. Eddie Guerrero. Eddie's another guy who the more I watched, the more I liked. When I first saw him, he was constantly feuding with Rob Van Dam over the Intercontinental Championship. They had some great matches, and I have fond memories of those battles. There's also a no DQ match he had with Edge on SmackDown that I recall liking a lot. Eddie was a good heel at this point and amazing in the ring, but he wasn't quite showing off the signature personality he would come to be known for. That all changed with Los Guerreros. Eddie and Chavo had a great act going with that team, and they were endlessly entertaining. Besides having great matches, their lovable antics had the crowd cheering for them when they were supposed to be heels. Their shift to fan favorites didn't change what we loved about them, and they were still shown to be as fun as ever. Eddie broke off into his big singles run after this, winning the US and later WWE championships. His rise was very natural, and his match with Brock Lesnar at No Way Out 2004 was one hell of a moment. I remember his match with Kurt Angle at WrestleMania 20 being pretty good, and his absolutely brutal feud with JBL where he lost the title. His frenemy relationships and matches with Rey Mysterio and Batista were highlights in the last few years of his career. His death was a total shock, and I still remember getting the call from my cousin telling me about it. He was one of a kind and is remembered fondly among fans and wrestlers alike. Going back to watch his stuff from WCW or ECW, you can see he was just a natural. Indeed, there was no one quite like Eddie Guerrero. Number 6. Kane. I have a pretty strong love-hate relationship with Kane. His comeback from injury in 2002 was the perfect time to jump on board with the character, as the Fire Still Burns promos they aired hyped his return and reintroduction. Upon his comeback, Kane was possibly my favorite guy for a while there. Yes, even through the Spinneroonie and Katie Vick stuff. I loved his look, I loved the chokeslam, and the history behind the character intrigued me. This led me to go back into the vault to find all his old matches from the Attitude Era. He was even cooler back then. I thought he was one of the best pure characters WWE ever put out there. Then he unmasked. I remember specific details about the night he was forced to show us his real face. I had a baseball game for a league I was in and was super eager to get home and watch his match with Triple H on Raw. I remember yelling to my mom from the dugout JR's quote, "Kane must win or unmask." The hype was off the charts, and I actually think the unmasking itself was done pretty well. From Kane punching a cracked mirror in his dressing room to his then tag partner Rob Van Dam being present after the loss, it's an unforgettable sequence. But what they did with him after this, I didn't really like. His burns were psychological, taking away from the character's history and mystique. Then he set JR on fire, electrocuted Shane McMahon's balls, and got Lita pregnant. But eventually he put the mask back on, and at least for a little while, it was cool to see that again. I also think Kane is an underappreciated wrestler. He's a pretty athletic big man, and when he was a little younger, he could have a great match when called upon. His career-long feud with his brother, The Undertaker, hasn't always been amazing, but they've been involved in some incredible stuff together. Speaking of which... Number 5. The Undertaker. This is not a unique thing. Millions of people love The Undertaker. I'm just one of them. The first version of Taker I was exposed to was the American Badass. Or Big Evil, I guess? Same thing. He was a cool big biker guy. I like this version of The Undertaker. It didn't last too long in the grand scheme of things, but now knowing the history of the character and what would follow, this time period is refreshing to go back and watch. He was a tough heel in those days, and I can clearly remember his feud with Hulk Hogan, especially the segment when he tied him up to the end of his motorcycle and dragged him all across backstage. Taker eventually made SmackDown his home for many years. He turned face, got buried by Kane in a vicious buried alive match with Vince McMahon, and returned to the dead man gimmick. It was during this point in the lead up to WrestleMania 20 that I went back and consumed everything I could about The Undertaker, renting old VHS pay-per-views, reading magazines, anything I could get my hands on about the guy. I was even drawing him for projects in art class. That's how big of a fan I was at this point. I just thought he was the most amazing wrestling character I ever saw. He was more like someone out of a movie than a sports entertainer, and his matches actually improved in some of his later years. Well, not now, but for a good chunk of time, Taker was putting on classics like his No Way Out 2006 match with Kurt Angle, and basically all his Mania matches from 2005 to 2013. The last wrestling-themed Top 5 video we tried at Channel Awesome was a countdown of Taker's best matches. We couldn't get it on YouTube, but I believe it's up on Vimeo. Check the description if you want to see that. In any case, The Undertaker's best years may be long behind him, but that can never erase the gigantic impact he's made on WWE and pro wrestling in general. Number 4. Edge. There's so much to say about Edge. We can talk about Edge and Christian, we can talk about his rise through the ranks as a singles, we can talk about his book, we can talk about his live sex celebration, we can talk about the rated R superstar, we can talk about his early retirement, and all the stuff in between and beyond. Bottom line is, Edge is one of the most well-rounded and dependable guys WWE had for a long time. He was an upper mid-carder when I first started watching, and I instantly gravitated to his charisma and in-ring ability. His feuds with Kurt Angle, Test, Eddie Guerrero, and more during this time stood out to me. Also, his tag team championship win with Hulk Hogan was a big moment early on. He was out with neck issues for a long while, and when he came back, something was different. He wasn't just a toothy babyface anymore. Edge had gotten a chip on his shoulder, and his matches with Randy Orton over the IC title showcased his new attitude. Through the stuff with Lita and Matt Hardy, Edge became one of the company's most hated heels and had no visible redeemable qualities. John Cena might be Edge's greatest rival, and their constant back and forth over the WWE title solidified Edge as one of the company's top stars. Also, his time spent on screen with an older Mick Foley may have been some of the best stuff of his career. His promos were amazing. There was so much believable emotion packed into his words, and no matter what he was saying, it felt authentic. He could be funny, serious, crazy, whatever they needed him to do, he did it well. And you can tell he had a lot of input into his character. It sucks that he had to retire so young, but Edge's career was a full one and speaks for itself. Number 3. CM Punk. I'm from the Chicago area, so this may seem like a given, but at the height of his game, CM Punk could do no wrong. Promos, matches, the guy was on fire for a good while there. One of the most popular stars of the modern era for sure. Even as a heel, with or without Paul Heyman, he always surpassed expectations. It's a shame that he got so burned out and lost his passion for the wrestling business, because Punk could probably still be contributing in some form, and we'd all be better off for it. I heard plenty about CM Punk years before his WWE debut. In addition to being a huge star in the Indies and in ROH, Punk was sort of a local legend. Whenever I went to close-by wrestling shows, there was always someone who knew him, or wrestled him, or was on a show with him. Around these parts, he's pretty much a folk hero. WWE's version of the Summer of Punk deepened that status. 2011 was a huge year for him. It was the perfect storm. He was set to walk away from the company, and his storyline with John Cena wrestling for the WWE Championship culminated in Chicago at Money in the Bank that year. I know, I keep bringing that show up, but if you were there in person, you'd understand why. My experience at that pay-per-view might deserve a video on its own, but the atmosphere in the Allstate Arena that night is something I'll probably never see or feel again. It's honestly hard to put into words what I was thinking. I've never been in a crowd like that, and Chicago always has good crowds, but this was different, and he was at the center of it. CM Punk was the most natural anti-authority figure in the company since Steve Austin, which is one of the reasons we were all hoping for that match for so long. I know he's done with wrestling, except for random ninja appearances, and has moved on to other endeavors, but to me and many other fans, he will always be remembered as that rebellious cult of personality. Number 2. Hollywood Hulk Hogan. I have a long and very complicated history regarding my feelings on this guy. He's probably the biggest reason I started watching wrestling in the first place, but it's nearly impossible to ignore his outside-the-ring situations when that personal business has been plastered all over the world for the better part of a decade. However, I cannot deny how gigantic of a Hulkamaniac I was in 2002. The way Hogan had me invested in every match he participated in during that time period gave me a feeling I've never had since. I was such a big fan. He was like a hero to me when I was younger, and I can't ignore that. Hell, I was a Hulk Hogan fan before I was a wrestling fan. As I mentioned before, I wasn't allowed to watch wrestling growing up, but I knew who Hulk Hogan was. So, I rented Mr. Nanny from our local video store and watched it way too many times. I later watched Suburban Commando and was even excited to see him in Three Ninjas High Noon at Mega Mountain. Dave Dragon was the most generic name ever, and Hogan's wig was hilarious, but I just really liked something about the guy. His return to the classic red and yellow following his split from the NWO had everyone back on the Hogan bandwagon, and I was right there with them. His matches with The Rock, Triple H, The Undertaker, Kurt Angle, Mr. McMahon, Brock Lesnar, and tag title win with Edge are some of my most vivid wrestling memories. Going back into the archives and watching his 80s run in the WWF and Hollywood Hogan days in WCW widen his legacy for me. These exciting times may have passed, but I'll always fondly recall how excited I was whenever the Hulkster cupped his hand to his ear and dropped the big leg. And my number 1 favorite WWE wrestler is Shawn Michaels. That's right, the showstopper, the main event, the icon, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. I love HBK, man. He was one of the guys that made the biggest impression on me when I was just getting into WWE. This was at the time of his big comeback after 4 years away in retirement with a back injury. He first showed up to be the talking piece for a revamped version of the NWO. When that fell apart, Michaels almost immediately reformed D-Generation X with Triple H, at least for one night. Hunter turned on his best friend that night, and the comeback story was in full effect. It was a compelling storyline, one of the best I've seen play out to this day. The blood feud between HBK and Triple H started with Michaels' in-ring return at SummerSlam '02, a phenomenal pay-per-view. Their unsanctioned match there was one for the ages, and Jim Ross's commentary helped me get even more into the emotion of it all. When they gave the Master of the Sweet Chin Music the Shock World title win at Survivor Series that year in the very first Elimination Chamber match, I was elated. From there, HBK went on to have a great last 8 years to his career. Memorable feuds, matches, and promos followed. A few standouts were anything with Chris Jericho, the 2006 DX reunion, Kurt Angle matches, the hour-long John Cena match, most of his matches with Triple H, his weirdly wonderful feud with Hulk Hogan featuring an amazing heel promo in Montreal, and of course, the Undertaker matches from WrestleManias 25 and 26. The one from 25 might still be my favorite single match ever. Discovering his older stuff from before the back injury just confirmed to me that he's the best I've seen. To me, no one comes close to Shawn Michaels. So what do you think of my favorites? Who are some of your favorites? Want more wrestling content on the channel? Leave me a comment and let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.